Morning, good evening. This is Tian, and welcome to the Boao dialogue, COVID-19 vis-a-vis globalization. It's an honor for me as a host of CGTN China Media Group to host and moderate this dialogue. Before we introduce the topic today, may I just say a few words about the format of today's event. It's going to be a 90-minute event divided into two parts. First, 60 minutes, interactions among the four distinguished speakers and panelists we have invited today. For the latter half, 30 minutes, we are going to have questions coming from stimulators. In other words, 20 to 25 members of the Boao family who are joining in this meeting room to propose questions to our panelists. While we are talking, we also have a few thousand members of the Boao family from different parts of the world that are listening and also watching today's session. Before I introduce the distinguished panelists today, the topic we're seeing today, COVID-19 vis-a-vis globalization, an extremely timely one. Before coming into the studio, the latest number we check confirmed the cases globally, COVID-19, more than 3 million already, and the number is growing exponentially. Over the past 100 days since the outbreak, we have seen, as a result of saving lives and also keeping social distance, closing of borders, travel bans, and the global trade have been in a downfall, or some even say free fall. So what does that mean for globalization, a topic that we all care and dear to our heart? I guess we are going to have the insights and the wisdom coming from our four panelists. And may I have the honor to introduce them. Thomas Friedman, author, columnist, and also recipient of 3 Pulitzer Prizes. Mr. Friedman, good to see you.
Good to be with you, Cheung.
Thank you, sir. Joseph Nye, former dean of Harvard Kennedy School of Government, well known for cultivating the concept of soft power. Professor Nye, good to see you.
It's nice to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wang Huiyao, founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Mr. Wang, good morning.
Good morning, Tian. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And Professor Cheung, the founding dean and professor of China Business and Globalization from Cheung Graduate School of Business. Professor Cheung.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Hello. So, time is limited. Let's jump directly to the questions. Professor Nye, you've been arguing in the latest article you wrote that we should be skeptical, you said, toward claims that the pandemic changes everything, end of quote. Explain to us, so you don't think the pandemic is going to change much? What about its relationship with globalization, Professor Nye?
Well, I would argue that when we think of globalization, we should realize that it's interdependence at intercontinental distances. And while some forms of globalization, for example, trade, will be damaged by the recession that accompanies the pandemic, and there's been or will be a diminishment of economic globalization in trade, pandemic itself represents a different type of globalization, which I call ecological globalization. Climate change is another example of ecological globalization. So some types of globalization, maybe the good types, will be slowed down by this episode. Other types will actually increase. And it's a mistake to think that globalization is purely economic and political. It's also ecological. And the ecological globalization obeys the laws of physics, not the laws of politics. No tariffs or borders will stop it. So yes, we're going to see more globalization, but maybe it'll be the wrong kind, not the best kind.
Interesting. So you divided the globalization into three categories. Mr. Friedman, I've been ardently reading your columns over the past a few weeks. Tell me more about what you think, because you've been trying to suggest there's something called the BC and AC, meaning before coronavirus and after coronavirus. Obviously, you see a huge impact of COVID-19. Tell me more about that regarding globalization.
Well, Tian, thank you, and great to be with you and the community. Let me pick up with a point that Joe raised, which is that I've been a journalist for 40 years. And in those 40 years, the biggest mistakes I've made as a journalist were when I began a column or a news story with this sentence: "The world will never be the same again." So you should really be humble about that. Yet this really is a profound event. And when it comes to globalization, as Joe said, I think there'll be contradictory effects. I've always believed that economists don't own the term globalization, that it isn't just about trade and financial flows. For me, when I wrote The World is Flat, what I was arguing is that globalization is about the ability of people to act globally. And what is unique about our era is that we're seeing globalization at the individual level, at the community level, at the company level, and at the government level. And so some aspects of globalization are going to be actually intensified, not only in the ecological way that Joe suggested, but I want to tell you about my day today, Tian. I began in the morning doing an event in New Delhi, sponsored by India Today, with thousands of Indians. In the afternoon, I spoke to 82 UN ambassadors, part of the small countries group at the UN, and I'm ending the day in a conversation with folks in Beijing and all over China. And so when people say to me, globalization is over, I say, what are you talking about? I've discovered through this Zoom process, Tianwei, that sitting across from your desk, as we've done in Beijing, this isn't as good as that, but this is about 85% as good. I really feel your presence. You can feel mine. I can see Henry and Joe and Professor, and so I'm doing more of this now. And although I'm not jet lagged, I'm not on a plane, I'm not killing myself. So I intend and already am so much more global than I've ever been before. And at the same time, obviously, because of the virus, trade flows and also people flows are going to be interrupted until there's a vaccine. But I do suspect after there's a vaccine, I don't see why, as we saw after the 1918 pandemic, that we won't return to globalization and even a more intense version, because we will have this new alternative that we're all going to develop skills in be able to interact globally now at a depth and therefore frequency and an ease for no money like never before.
Interesting. I hope you'll have a good evening with our discussion after a busy day, I guess. And we are just starting the day, right? Mr. Wang, Huiyao in Beijing here this morning. So you heard from your American counterparts about how they see globalization, pandemic. Some argue actually it's even more than people could imagine. Others say, well, it depends on which part of globalization we are talking about. Sir, you've been doing research about globalization for a long time. Tell me more about your thoughts, particularly your observations regarding your experiences here in China.
Yeah, thanks, Tian, and all the distinguished panelists. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating topic, and we're talking about globalization, and I think that globalization, since we have the Bretton Woods moment, we had in the last some decades, this year is also the 75th anniversary of the UN establishment. I think globalization certainly brought so much changes, as actually mentioned by Joe and Thomas, and I think that we see that in all aspects, not only economic, but socially and people to people. and including the conference we're having now. But of course, this pandemic actually, I think has probably brought us together in some part of our globalization. For example, we realized we have to unite to fight this certain attack from out of the blue, where the global villagers are facing the attack from Mars or from this pandemic, for example. So we really have to work together in some like vaccine development and things like that. So also, I think globalization may be going to suffer a bit on the economic, as Joe mentioned. But I think on the other hand, like we have to strengthen the global public health governance and also the global trading system so that we can really get a quick recovery while at the same time contain the virus and or even get rid of the virus. And so that's very important. Also the global value chain, as China now is starting back to work, and China is back in reviving the production and the livelihood as much as they can. We are having a 5-day off this weekend for the May holidays, and a lot of people I know are going traveling probably within the region. So you see that China has to also play active role in order to support this global value chain, not to be totally collapsed. And also, I see also some probably technology-wise, we probably have some decoupling, as we have seen that some politicians are attacking on that. But let's remember, the U.S. being the largest economy, China is the second largest economy. We, both countries have a huge responsibility and duties to really maintain a good global, inclusive globalization. I think globalization is not perfect. It certainly needs a lot of upgrade and change, but definitely this is a trend that we are living in an even smaller world. So really, I agree with both Joe and Tom, and globalization will continue. Of course, we need to update on that.
Globalization will continue, depends on which area we're talking about. Public health might be more cooperation, while other areas could be a bit challenging. We'll see. Mr. Xiang, Professor Xiang, you've been doing your research about global trade and the globalization of trade for a long time. You're an advocate of that. Tell me more about whether this pandemic is going to exacerbate the earlier talks about the globalization facing problems, or is it going to help to bring people together to rethink the significance of globalization?
Well, it is important to note many of the issues challenge we talk about today emerged long before the coronavirus. And of course, some of the issues arising from the coronavirus are unique. I would like to focus my remarks on 3 levels. Level 1, the global governance is totally dysfunctional. And when you don't have an effective global governance, it's difficult to have a really good globalization that will bring a lot of common global good. For global governance to work, US must come back to the leadership role. US is an indispensable nation. Number 2, China-US must work together. We contribute about 45% of global GDP, vast majority of economic increment. When those 2 nations don't work together, there's no possibility of global governance. Thirdly, the international organizations, whether WTO, WHO, must be strengthened, especially today in light of the rise of protectionist policies and nationalism. The international organizations become more important because they look at issues which are not so much constrained by domestic politics. This is level 1. Level 2, at the nation state level, they will intensify the debate between authoritarian system and democracies, and debate between collectivism and the individualism. And you're going to see the rise of, the self-reliance or sufficiency argument to be used against trade at the company level. And I agree with Tom Friedman, like globalization, key element of globalization is the company's ability to leverage resource globally. I think this outbreak will put some constraints on that. And many of the companies we will have second thoughts about this global supply chain. And the supply chain for the future must be able to accommodate the potential hiccup posed by the coronavirus, you know. So, I mean, collectively, I think, I don't look at this not only as a crisis, but it's also opportunity for us to have a soul-searching reflection, many of the issues we have had. I think it's important to be in solidarity, to be positive, constructive, and cooperative. And I think we might have a much better world and globalization in the future. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Cheung already gave us the, the 20-year plan of the world, The US must come to the leadership role again. The US, China work together and let the institutions internationally work again. Okay, but those are important tasks. Let me come back to you, Professor Nai. Are they achievable given the realities? I mean, particularly recently, you've been talking and writing a lot about aspects. Let's start from China-US cooperation, which of course, many of our viewers watching this Zoom session will be extremely interested in, but of course, with the context of globalization in the background. Professor.
Well, I think what we've seen is a failure of leadership in both the US and China. A coronavirus doesn't care the nationality of the human it kills, but the US and China have both spent an awful lot of time placing blame on the other for who did what, when, and who's to blame. This is ridiculous. There's so much more to be gained from cooperation than from this war of words or propaganda that the two countries have engaged in. In the book that I've just published, Do Morals Matter, I argue that we have to learn to distinguish a new type of power, power with others versus power over others. And if you take something like the coronavirus, we can't deal with that alone, we meaning the United States, and China can't deal with it alone. We have to deal with it together, along with other countries. Or to go back to something that Professor Cheung mentioned, the US and China are 45% of GDP. We also, the two of us, are 40% of greenhouse gases in terms of climate change. We can't solve that problem of climate change alone. China can't solve it alone. We have to solve it with each other. So while we still have conflicts which relate to power over others, we have to realize that there's another dimension that globalization puts on the table, such as pandemics or climate change, where we have to think of power with others. And frankly, I think there's been a collective leadership failure in both our countries in the early stages of these lesson we've learned from the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. And in the last chapter of my book, I argue the great moral question for the future is, can we broaden our horizons to think in terms of power with others? And frankly, I'm a little bit discouraged at what I've seen so far.
Professor Nai, if I could just follow up a little bit, I'm sure many that are watching our session today are remembering very well your earlier concept of the soft power. So how does that work with what you have just argued? Power with others rather than over the others. Tell us about the evolution of thoughts you have had reaching this conclusion, if you can briefly, sir.
Well, soft power is the ability to get others to do what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And when you take a broad definition of your national interest, or when you try to appeal and attract others, you develop soft power. And so in that sense, if we took a broader position than we've been taking, we would both enhance the soft power of our countries. And I don't mean just propaganda. Trouble with propaganda is people don't believe it. So propaganda doesn't really generate soft power. As I sometimes say, the best propaganda is not propaganda, but real cooperation. That makes you attractive, and that develops a country's soft power. And it's not a zero-sum game. You could see an increase in China's soft power and American soft power at the same time.
It could be going parallel.
Exactly.
Professor Xiang Bing, did Professor Nai give you the answer to achieve your 20-year grand agenda?
Well, actually, when we set our business school in 2002, we list out these two as priorities. Number one, global perspective, global responsibility. Second one, we introduce humanity. We hope the next generation business leaders will compete with compassion, empathy. I would like to see this global pandemic will bring more positive elements of humanity and then fix our problem better. I think compassion, empathy, very, very important. If the government keep on fighting, if they cannot settle all the problem, it really up to the business sector, the business schools, a Kennedy school like, to civil society, to work together, to introduce the compassion, empathy, and the collaboration and the cooperation, the positive elements humanity together. We need to work together. Not only the government, the other non-governmental sector can play important in this regard. Thank you.
Mr. Friedman, therefore I have to come back to you about that. I mean, when the two are not necessarily saying geopolitics is going to design all the agenda regarding globalization, tell us more about what about the other players who you've been talking to as a columnist and a well-known journalist. How are they playing the role? How are they doing their thinking right now over just 100 days, over the past 100 days?
Which other players do you have in mind, Jimmy?
For example, business community. For example, the people-to-people exchanges. Are they going to be able to go beyond what was it like before the pandemic, when geopolitics was pretty much playing a big role regarding globalization, by the way?
You know, I don't think so. I think it would be an illusion to think they can. China's thrown out the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal from Beijing. We've thrown out Chinese journalists from Washington. So hard to see how our communication is going to be better and our understanding is going to be better when we're removing each other's journalists, just to take an example of that. There was already tension within the business communities over trade before this. In a world where travel will be more restricted, hard to believe that will go down. So, you know, I'm a big believer this really has to start at the top. And that, you know, to go back to Joe's earlier point of you know, we're facing a global ecological threat. The number one challenge for the global community is resilience. Resilience first in the face of this pandemic, but later in the face of climate change. And I'm a big believer that the 40-year period, 1979 to 2019, was a historical epoch in terms of U.S.-China relations. It was an epoch in the sense, and this is a way of answering your question, Tian, that any American businessman could get up any morning and say, I'd like to have a factory in China as part of my supply chain. And any Chinese student could say, I'd like to apply to Joe Nye's school at Harvard, unconsciously. I, as a reporter, could say, I want to go to China and visit my friends Henry and Tian and do it, unconsciously. It was 4 decades of unconscious, relatively speaking, integration. And I would argue that the relative peace and prosperity of the world over that 4-decade period was highly influenced and contributed to by that unconscious integration between our two countries. I believe that era is over, at least for now. I will certainly miss that. But the idea of an American businessman now waking up and say, I'm going to have a factory in China, I don't think so. A Chinese who says, I'd like to invest in a solar project in America. No, not so easy anymore. So that ease of integration that we saw for 40 years, whose positive byproduct was that I think a lot of global stability and prosperity, I think will be diminished. How far it is diminished, how much it is diminished in the AC era after Corona, I don't know. But it won't just be about the coronavirus. It will be about tensions in the relationship that were brewing in the BC era before Corona that Corona has exacerbated. But that 40-year epic, I think, is over, Tianwei. I hope we can replace it with something durable, but I think it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge for leadership in both countries.
Mr. Wang, Henry, from Beijing, Tom seemed to suggest, okay, let's stop being naive, okay? The pandemic is not going to change everything, and even about geopolitics. But to me, it's interesting because many believe COVID-19 is a stress test for a lot of things. And true colors might be reflected as a result of this. Now, Mr. Wang, do you think this can be a pressure in a way for leaders to further come together because there is really a necessity for it? The virus is going to penetrate into any of the vulnerable crack the human society has, no matter it's about geopolitics or other things. Before a vaccine is born, could leadership rise, come to the sole mission of theirs for the next few months to work together, at least on public health and some of the public good issues, such as climate change and others, even though there's an election year going on in one of the major economies?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Absolutely. I think that Tom is right. I mean, we have to really work together on this pandemic issue. And you know, globalization for the last 75 years, we've been avoiding the Third World War precisely because we have a Bretton Woods system in place that we actually you know, survived the last 75 years. But now we are facing the most imminent danger that were never faced by the human beings, humankind. Because for the last, you know, we've seen that. It's a totally disrupted world. We are coming to a close down of the borders, airlines, everything. People stop meeting each other face to face. That's terrible. And then that's really causing a lot of a problem. So on top of that, this has been accelerated by the mistrust and of course by all the things that Joe has mentioned. So there's also conspiracy theory that floating around and then all those things. So what I think that we have to come back on that, and probably pandemic will serve as a leverage for really people to work together to say we have to work together in order to survive this crisis. And then you know, for that I think I agree with Tom that perhaps we cannot go back to the exactly 40 years in the past. But also probably people in the world have to also think again and to watch China a little differently, because for example, China is the first country to contain the virus, you know, after 2 months of a lockdown. And China is the first country to start to revive the economy. China is still continue. China is supplying the world with all the protective and fighting virus mask and things like that. China is, you know, hopefully getting out of this is more, you know, matured in terms of handling a lot of international relations. But what's more, I think that we realize now we are living in the same planet. We cannot live without each other. And precisely for the reason we have to continue to fight pandemic, we have to fight climate change, we have to fight many other issues. And the global recession is coming around the corner now. And so absolutely, we probably will see some technology decoupling, but not really forcing each other to become start everything on their own, and then we have a several system in the world and several decoupled world in the system. So that's something I worry about. You know, if we don't have a strong leadership from both U.S. and China and the EU, if we don't continue that, we will have a world of a regionalization, and we will get into several camps of the different technology system, and then we are more vulnerable in fighting the common threat to the humankind. So this is so important. We have to have an enhanced and updated, a more globalized approach, especially U.S. and China.
Professor Cheung, I want to pick up what Mr. Wang just said. He talked about one crucial issue, which is so dear to our discussion today, which is the economy and the global trade. And the recession, as we all believe, is around the corner, unfortunately, and it's likely to be of quite a scale, probably even more than 2008 and 9. So Professor Cheung, from your perspective, can we just let everything go free downfall? What efforts can be made to turn back the picture or change what some believe as the momentum? Can we let geopolitics dominating the agenda and also the way of doing things?
I have 3 points here. Number one, I agree with Professor Joseph in the sense of all the common challenges faced by humanity, whether it's pandemic, threat of terrorists, climate change, sustainability, all of that. You need U.S., China work together. No plan B. This is the only plan we have. I hope reasonable common sense will prevail. This is number one. Number two, with Trump administration, America first, that's maybe the beginning and end of the WTO era. And this coronavirus may be the official end of the WTO.
There is a little problem with the voice of yours. Maybe our technical people could also help you with that, Professor Cheung. I'm going to come back to you a little bit later, okay, if it's possible. Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Friedman, are you with us?
Yep.
Yeah. So could you jump on that about, the immediate and the urgent issue of the global economy? Without the economy, jobs lost, and more than trade wars, and also the growth rate of the world, which will have a huge impact on what we want to achieve together, and certainly for individual countries as well.
Well, this goes back to the unique nature of the threat we face today with a virus. And, one of President Trump's failures was, can you hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, no, good. So early on in the crisis, one reason I think President Trump failed to jump on this as urgently as he needed to was because he tends to view the world through the prism of the market. And so he believed that if the market was going up, then whatever he was doing was succeeding. Unfortunately, and Trump is not someone imbued with the natural world, okay? Unfortunately, while Trump was following the market, Mother Nature was invisibly, silently, inexorably, exponentially, and mercilessly spreading the coronavirus around the world. And so when you're up against Mother Nature, you have to remember she's just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up, you can't talk her down, you can't say, Mother Nature, we've been having a bad recession. Could you take a little time off? She's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And she always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. Do not mess with Mother Nature. So this is not like a war, okay? In a war, we could, in World War II, we could out-mobilize and we could out-manufacture Germany and Japan. In the Cold War, we could out-innovate and outspend the Soviet Union. But when you are up against Mother Nature, you cannot defeat her. She's just chemistry, biology, and physics. When she throws a challenge at you, whether it's climate change or virus, the only way to deal with that is to adapt, okay? That's what she does. When she throws challenges at people, the people who win are not the strongest. The people who win are not the smartest. As Darwin taught us, the people who win are the most adaptive. So we face this incredible global challenge of adaptation. Now, the only way to successfully do that is you have to bring three, I think, states of mind to that challenge. First of all, you have to be incredibly humble. If you do not respect this virus, it will kill you or someone you love. Number one, you got to be humble. Number two, you have to be incredibly coordinated. It's been our great failures in America. We have 50 different states going 50 different directions. You have to be incredibly coordinated because this virus will find any crack in your armor or in your body. And lastly, you have to be entirely about chemistry, biology, and physics. You have to be entirely science grounded in your strategy, because if you're not, and Mother Nature is, she will kill you or someone you love.
We love our Mother Nature, but at the same time, she's very strict with the naughty actions we have, right, on the earth. So Professor Nye, I want to come back to you. What about that global supply chain? I know you are working a lot on geopolitics, but it's supposed to help us in terms of progress, I would believe. So what about global supply chain? What about global trade? What about global investment? How we are likely to see it from a totally different lens or slightly different lens?
Well, I think we are going to see damage to the global supply chains that were built up in the 40-year period that Tom referred to. This was already happening before the coronavirus. And I think that's a loss to all of us. I think you're going to see much more damage to the trade part of globalization, a little less to the finance part of globalization, but you're not going to see changes in the basic social globalization, as Tom observed. The telecommunications of the internet are here to stay. And in addition to that, you're not going to see a reduction of some of the ecological globalization I mentioned. So it's going to be a very mixed package. There'll be some supply chains that will be cut for security. There are others that will continue. Some will increase. It's going to be a mixed bag. But I'd like to call attention on the economics to a dimension we haven't talked about, is we've talked about US and China, but you also have countries which are poor countries, which are less capable of dealing with the pandemic than US and China or Europe or Japan are. And those countries may become reservoirs for the virus. And again, the virus doesn't care about nationality. It doesn't care about region. And in that sense, we should be thinking much more about how do we help the economic situation of these poor countries in terms of their capability. What we know from 1918 with the influenza epidemic is it came in waves. And in fact, the second wave was more destructive than the first. It may turn out that coronavirus will also come in waves, and that future waves will have their origins in reservoirs in poor countries, which are less able to cope with it, and where the vaccine, when it finally arrives, will be less widely spread less quickly. And in that sense, I think we ought to be thinking, if we talk about global economic problems and globalization, I'd like to see, as I've written in a number of columns, I'd like to see the US and China jointly propose a major COVID adaptation fund under the United Nations for all poor countries that want to apply. In other words, I think it's in our interest to do this. And what I find so appalling is that this is a moment where we could have transformed world politics if we had done that. Instead, we have a propaganda war between the US and China, and we've lost this opportunity. Somebody called it the loss of the Sputnik moment. I would have called it loss of a Marshall Plan moment. We could have done something, and still could, that's truly creative about economics on a global scale, but we're missing it. And to me, this is a sad comment on the world as it is today.
Professor Cheung, I promise you to come back. I hope we are okay now. So you want to comment about what Professor Nye just proposed. In fact, this is the real time to do something together, and we need to catch this golden opportunity, not only for our own economies, but also global economies. But I still want you to also comment on the global supply chains and also the cross-border investment, because they are also extremely dear to the hearts of the business communities around the world.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Hello?
A little tricky, but you can go ahead.
Yeah,
Let's test a little bit.
Yeah, I think maybe the WTO was over. You're going to see the rise of regional, bilateral, trilateral trade deals. I see the new NAFTA, the deal between Japan and Europe, and I see the warming up relations between China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN countries. And you see, for the first quarter of this year, ASEAN has become the largest trading partner of China. So there's adjustments in global supply chains been taking place for some time. And for the future, if the situation becomes more nationalistic, there are few economic blocs might do well. China will do well because China has more complete supply chain and value clusters. Also has a sizable domestic market. Europe will do well. US may have to consolidate a little bit into its global supply chain. You're going to continue to see some shift of the manufacturing activities from China to ASEAN and other countries, and other countries, those regions. So this whole adjustment will continue. But if nationalism on the rise and some smaller size economy will now be able to practice self-reliance policy. So that's going to be a challenge.
So you're suggesting that, first of all, there's a need for economic globalization and also try to revive the earlier synergy. Meanwhile, you also argue there is a backup plan for a lot of economies. They have their own ways of dealing with the upcoming challenges. Mr. Friedman, coming back to you also about the global supply chains and cross-border investment. In face of recession, would the business communities be able to figure out a way to do it as long as there is market? I want to throw you a number. Earlier, I talked to the chairman of the AmCham in China, and they've been doing surveys. American Chamber of Commerce, by the way, that's the American business community here in this country. They've been doing surveys one after another every 2 weeks, asking their members, a few thousand strong companies of Americans in China, whether they want to remove the earlier global supply chain, they want to relocate. Interestingly, very different from the rhetoric we have seen in some of the media coverage. Most of them, only very slight 1 or 2% suggesting, well, they are trying to do it. But 70% of those being surveyed are suggesting they want to take a look at the realities and the real numbers and the real data. They are not deciding, and they are not in the process yet to decide. So it's very interesting as to what is being cooked or mentioned in the public and media vis-a-vis how the real business communities are working every day. Are we seeing this disconnect driving us further apart from the real agenda and the real actions to work together, Professor? Mr. Friedman, please.
Yeah, well, I think you have to really distinguish between critical goods and just sort of general supply chain. I think there is an awareness out of this crisis that there are medicines, there are medical equipment that the supply chain was so distant and easily interrupted that we do want to move to America. But I think the broad, again, I go back to where I started, Tianwei, I always regretted when I said the world will never be the same again. You know, that broad integration of US and China was driven by deeply powerful economic logic. And whether it's for auto parts or washing machines or golf balls, you know, business will seek out ultimately the low-cost, high-quality producer wherever it is. And so I would distinguish, I think there are aspects, particularly around, we've discovered drugs and medicine where, you know, supply chain goes from China to Germany to Great Britain to America, you know, and that I think there will be a desire to bring some of those home. But I'd be very, very careful about saying this is the end of US-China supply chains. That said, again, what the coronavirus does is that it accelerates so many previous trends. So before this, of course, there was a previous trend of delinking going on between the US and China, but it was really a product of a very different phenomena. It was a product of actually China's economic development and technological development in this sense. For 40 years, we bought from China what I call shallow goods. Shoes we wore on our feet, socks we wore on our ankles, pants we wore on our legs, jackets we wore on our shoulders, solar panels we put on our roofs, okay? We bought things that were exterior to us. We bought what I call shallow goods. And we sold China deep goods. We sold you computers, software, telecommunications, and microchips, things that went deep into your economy. Now, as a result of China's own technological development, it is now in a position to sell us deep goods. And that's what the whole Huawei story was a proxy for, because there wasn't a trust framework between the two countries. You had to buy our deep goods because you had no choice. But now that you can make deep goods and we have a choice, because of the absence of a broader trust framework between our two countries, that when it comes to whether I want Huawei embedded in my wall, in my bedroom, on my phone, inside my computer, there was already resistance building up to that. It was becoming an issue because of the changing character of our trade, that we are both now in the deep business. And so that was going on before this. And I feel this crisis will exacerbate that. And that's not a good thing. It's not actually even smart economics for America, because if Huawei ends up making its own chips, its own operating system, that probably will end up competing against us. And so that's where we were on the eve of this crisis. It will probably be exacerbated by the crisis.
I'm so glad that our conversation is not only retrospective, but also prospective in terms of looking at the past and also looking at the future. Mr. Wang, Henry, please join us here on this point. Now, China and the US trade, global supply chain relations to that is enormous. However, when it comes to globalization, Professor Nai also earlier pointed out, so is Professor Cheung, there are 60% of the global GDP that are coming from somebody else. I mean, that are coming from, besides China and the global population and also global influence coming from other parts of the world. So when we think about the issue of globalization, global supply chain, cross-border investment, China, US are an important component. But what about the overall picture? Not to mention, also all of you mentioned, the international institutions, for example, the United Nations and various organizations related to it. How is that likely to function? So this seems like a very comprehensive picture we need to take a look at. Mr. Wang.
Thank you, Tian. I think you're absolutely right. You know, both also our friends has been mentioned that as well. I think it's utterly most important to maintain the global value chain. And China and the US are the two pivotal partners, including EU and Japan, For example, since China opened up in the last 4 years, there's 70,000 U.S. company has operation in China, as you said, checked with M. Chair as well. And then, they generated 700 to 900 billion US dollar revenues. So no companies really like to move out of China because they're so vitally connected. And then the Great Wall is not built in one day. So this global value chain is not going to be dismantled in a day or in a year or even 5 years. So I think that, the globalization momentum will continue, if our two countries and other countries are work together. And that's number one. Number two, I think I totally agree with what Professor Nai just mentioned about this. Can US and China build up a Corona Fund to have a new plan? Maybe this can be, work together with Belt and Road, or maybe with some kind of a UN-led plan that we can really stimulate the world economy growth. And that's absolutely important. And also, I agree with Professor Cheung as well. The WTO, we should be strengthened as well. I had CCG has conducted the online webinar. Also, we had Pascal Nabi, Wendy Carter, and Alan Wolf, and also the former Chief Justice of WTO, because we all said, now we should not let the Secretary, making initiative. The member countries should really work together. For example, can we reduce the tariff for the medical, supply mask and the ventilator and all those things? Can we really get the agriculture products? Now we are having an agriculture crisis probably coming as well. And also the e-commerce. Can we really stimulate the e-commerce? Because one of the experience China has this time is the online community, online e-commerce, goods delivery is an important tool to fighting coronavirus. And shall we really, stimulate that? And also the new infrastructure, the 5G, the telecom is online. So that kind of structure, maybe with the new plan to stimulate the economy, and I think the WHO and any other UN system can really help on that. And furthermore, I think this we had with Paris Peace Forum just 2 days ago with the Secretary General of the WHO, which said that we also need WHO point two to really upgrade and unite the world to fight that, because that is going to continue. We may have another stress. So overall, I think no country is an island. If not anything else, this coronavirus has taught us, we have to work together. We are really global villagers, and we cannot, survive if we fight each other. And it's really ridiculous how ridiculous we are. We are not united. So that's really the lesson we learned.
Yeah, Professor Nai, you mentioned about global institutions earlier in your proposal. So can they be up and running? Even though we seem to have one of the most important global economies not necessarily being proactive, so I use this adjective, at least in supporting them, such as WHO temporarily. Professor Nai.
Well, I think President Trump made a serious mistake in withdrawing American funding from WHO. I can't think of a more foolish action at this time in the crisis. It doesn't mean that WHO is flawless. It has many problems. The problems, though, arise from the member states, which have been unwilling to give it enough resources or enough authority to do what it needs to do. On the other hand, let's look back historically. We were able, under the WHO, as a world, to eradicate smallpox. The WHO did help to stimulate cooperation between US and China in the aftermath of SARS. We had state-to-state cooperation, but we also had WHO units. We should be thinking about a way to reform and strengthen WHO. The same thing with WTO. There are many good reasons why WTO has been criticized in the United States. Many people in the US feel that China basically didn't want a level playing field in trade, and with state-owned banks giving subsidies to state-owned enterprises, there was really not a level playing field, and that WTO rules and procedures needed reform. The right way to do this is not to destroy the institutions, it's to think about strengthening them. So I think we're going to need these institutions more than ever. And alas, I'm afraid the directions that the US government has taken under the Trump administration have been in the wrong direction. Another example of this is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, another very foolish action. So we have to strengthen these institutions.
It's so easy, as we all know, it's just common sense to destroy something rather than build something. And Mr. Friedman, to fire the firefighters, it's not the way to do when you want to extinguish a fire. So those are common sense logic. Having said that, though, I want to come back to our discussion about the global supply chain and whether global institutions would provide certain kind of momentum to further strengthen this against the headwind of geopolitics.
I don't really think so, Jianwei. Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of elephants in the room that I think we have to talk about. You know, one is the fact that, and I speak as someone, as you know, who believes that the world is more resilient when China and America are working together. But as Joe alluded to, we had serious issues with China on trade, about access, about fairness, and about rules that were partially resolved by the trade agreement, but they were not. And these go well beyond the personal views and I would even say excesses of President Trump. And we would be not having an honest conversation if we talked about the global and coming together and not talking about some very core, deep issues between the US and China that if Biden replaces Trump, will still be there. And the second one that's very important is it's very important, I think, for China to share with the world how this virus started. That's very important. I don't think we can have a normal relationship. And I say this as someone, I'm not blaming anybody here, but I want, and I think the world wants to know how this started so it won't happen again, because this has been a world tipping event. And so I think it would be a fanciful illusion to talk about US-China relations and kind of multilateral organizations or whatnot, when there's these two giant elephants in the room that concern people like me, who are fair-minded people who believe in the US-China relationship, let alone the Fox News crowd or the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. They'll be very happy to use China as a whipping boy to defeat Joe Biden and to embarrass Democrats. So, so I think that we have to be honest about that, and we need to be talking about that.
Got that. We don't want to do any promotion for any media organizations for now, and also, but I want to throw that question to Professor Xiang. You have your colleague talking about what he considers as the elephants in the room. Now, how would economies and countries try to figure out some of the unresolved issue now and work with the scientific community and the international institutions in order to have the rest of the international community come to consensus about that? I'm not talking specifically about China or the United States, but generally speaking, as a result of the latest outbreak of COVID-19. Professor Xiang, will that, though, a challenge, but at the same time, an opportunity?
Yes, it is opportunity. Without China and the US really working together, there's no possibility of strengthening international organizations, no possibility global governance, no possibility new round of WTO for decades to come. So you can see a regionalization. And in terms of trade relation between US-China, I agree with Mr. Friedman, you know, what I call non-mainstream sectors dominated by Chinese companies, shoes, ties, socks, lighters, sewing machines, labor-intensive, heavily polluting. To a large extent, the Chinese companies have been more like a domestic helper for the US companies. We only got one company that really can compete in mainstream market is Huawei. We don't have many of those, okay? But Huawei is now the national security ground, but you have many dominant American company operating in China, you know. So this issue, you know, there's a fairness issue from US perspective. There's also fairness issue from Chinese perspective. You know, we only got one, we only got one company. You know, so I think you look at value distribution, you know, for Barbie doll, retail price $10 US. Chinese company got 35 cents, labor intensive, heavily polluting. We're shifting some of that to ASEAN country now. So the complementarity of the two economies are there. Yes, with coronavirus, more and more sectors will be classified as strategic, national security, but there's going to be so many sectors that really need this globalness. So globalization will be there. Thank you.
Mr. Wang, an interesting question related also to Professor Nai, Mr. Friedman's mentioning of their concerns and issues. How can we see the topic of misinformation vis-a-vis transparency, particularly in our cultivating the understanding of what exactly happened since the outbreak? Now, if I could read both media, certainly I feel there are different sets of information that are taken as facts. If the facts are so different in so many different versions, how can we come to a consensus about things? Not to even mention, how can we understand what is misinformation and what is real transparency underway? Mr. Wang, sorry being philosophical, but I have to throw a question like that to you because I don't want to take sides.
No, I think you're asking the right question. I think that very unfortunate, you know, from very start that we had the WHO involved, and the WHO is constantly, you know, announced, you know, all kinds of developments and, you know, sharing the sequential of the genes of the virus and things like that. But unfortunately, I think we had a very poisoning political environment. It's also a year of the election. Of course, we see the ads around President Trump making a lot of comments. Many of them have never been to China, you know, very seldom they come to China. So, but also from China, also we have a communication effectiveness as well. I mean, we can only see the government spokesperson talking or ambassadors, but then, you know, you see in the US, you have a congressman, you have a media, you have a think tanks, you have everybody's talking. Whereas in China, we only have probably one or two voices. You know, from the society, from all levels of life, all walks of life, is not much being shared. And Chinese are not using Twitter and also international social media. On the international social media, China was very weak and not being able to share because due to different reasons. But what I can see is now, you know, for example, there's a lot of good stories about helping each other. You know, when China was hit, and the U.S., you know, versus Chinese student, American multinationals are helping China. And then also when this happened, and the Chinese company like, you know, Alibaba or Huawei and many companies are helping you. All those good news never shared and communicated. So we got to get the, you know, downward spiral of the negative sentiment. And that's really, I think, the communication problem, which also caused a lot of misinformation. Plus the social, plus the nationalism, populism, you know, fake news and things like that. That complicated the situation. So I think, you know, we should really, you know, have a more levels from China probably talking on these issues rather than only one channel from the government. But also, for example, CCT is doing with Chinese People's Friendship Association, we are doing a research now on how in a society, US and China and the companies and the society and all walks of life helping each other fighting coronavirus. I mean, those good stories should be told. So I think there's a communication problem, there's a perception problem, and also there's a channel, and also there's also missing in trust about the two system, ideological system that plays a lot of role. So a lot of things accumulated for a long time, but I think we should really use this chance, you know, to really get a lot of things work together rather than different.
If I could just provide to many of those, including our 4 distinguished panelists, to take a look at the timelines, both by WHO and also put forward by China, and I believe would be in the future put forward by the US administration about how they've been fighting the COVID-19. It will be very helpful because time and exact actions and also by whom, these are crucial information. And meanwhile, if I could also remind everyone, I have learned as a journalist, I'm sure together with Tom and many others around the world, that listen to the voices of the scientists. We don't want just to listen to a few social groups, but rather the ones who are really knowing the root of the issues. And all of you been sharing some wonderful insights. May I have every one of you to raise a question for the whole panel, or specific distinguished panelists that you want to ask to? And we want to have short questions and short answers. My proposing of questions is not very professional because they are extended and long, but I'm sure you have much better ways of asking your colleagues. Shall we start with Professor Nai, please?
Well, I'd like to hear from our colleagues what they think US-China relations would look like if there had not been a coronavirus. I think what Tom said is that they were already going in the wrong track, and there was a deep resentment in many parts of the US about things like China 2025, or the proclamation that China would be ahead in 2030 on artificial intelligence. And that led to a decoupling in the area of technology, which I think would be there without coronavirus and will be there after coronavirus. And so I'd like to know from our colleagues what they think the world would look like if there hadn't been a coronavirus in terms of US-China relations.
Now that's a very interesting way of asking a question. Professor Cheung, you want to take it first, and then Mr. Wang, very briefly, both of you. Thank you, sir.
I think the China-US relation is not in good shape, and with this coronavirus, we can turn around if we have the will, if we have this positive mindset, if we have the compassion, empathy. So I'm still positive because I believe in plan A, because no plan B. That's my remark, yes.
Okay, plan A. Mr. Wang, same plan A?
Thanks, Professor Nai. I think that without this coronavirus, I think the phase one will be certainly more laid. It's a turning point. I think we have 2 or 3 years of trade frictions. So the phase one actually brought us together. I mean, now China also bought over 5 billion agricultural product and things like that. So that was interrupted probably by this coronavirus. And if not the coronavirus, we're getting the phase 2 now already. So I think that was the right direction. And then if not, I think also we probably can work together on many multilateral issues if not coronavirus. But now it's actually a chance for us to work together on this now. It's really important US-China work together.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Friedman?
Well, I'm curious to ask Joe how he sees U.S. relations with Europe, Europe's cohesiveness, and U.S.-Russia relations being affected by this whole coronavirus.
Grand question, but Joe, you want to take that, Professor Nai?
Well, I think the US-European relationship was already damaged by President Trump's attitudes toward European allies. We saw a lack of trust or loss of trust, but I think it's been further damaged by the way the Americans have thought in terms of relatively narrow responses. So I think US-Europe relations are worse. US-Russision relations are bad. I'm not sure they've been made worse by the coronavirus. I think basically they were bad before Corona, and I think they're going to remain bad afterwards.
Okay, concise and precise. Mr. Wang, you have some question for your American counterparts or for your other colleague?
Yeah, sure. I would ask Professor Nye that you know in your article you were talking about the global order, and then will not be likely to change of this. But also you talk about a lot about soft power, which I think you're absolutely right. So what do you think about how China can enhance its soft power? You probably has been asked before. Also, I'd like to ask Tom again. Also, you've been probably named the globalization. For many times the world is flat and things like that. So, what do you think the world after the COVID-19 is it still flat, or are we having a more long horizon to flattening the world?
We want to flatten the curve, certainly.
Yeah.
But Professor Nye, you want to go first?
Well, I just quickly on soft power. If you look at the soft power 30, which is an index which is published in London every year, China comes out about number 27 on the soft power 30. And if you say, how could China raise its standing? It should give more role to civil society. Great deal of American soft power comes not from the government actions. Sometimes government actually hurts soft power. It comes from things like universities, Hollywood, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and so forth. So I would say ease up on civil society is the most important way you could increase China's soft power.
All right. Mr. Friedman?
Henry, I would say that globalization, it's going to be, it's really going to depend on whether we understand that this coronavirus was just the warm-up act for climate change. And that climate change, there are two differences between the coronavirus and climate change. The first is climate change doesn't peak. It doesn't peak. If we lose the Antarctic ice sheet, if we lose the Arctic ice sheet, if we lose the Greenland ice sheet, if we lose the Antarctic ice sheet, they will no longer reflect the sun's rays, the oceans will rise, and we will boil the ocean. And the other difference between coronavirus and climate change is there's no herd immunity to climate change. There's just an endless pounding on the herd. And if we can't see that collectively, that train coming down the track, and it's going to run both of us over, if that doesn't get us to act globally together at the speed, scope, and scale we need, so we can manage what is now unavoidable and avoid what will be unmanageable, then there's the kind of instability we're seeing now will simply be a permanent feature and will diminish our lives. So I think there's a lot riding on U.S.-China coming together.
Okay, so unlike COVID-19, we've already got a vaccine for climate change, right? That is a global cooperation. We got a plan already. The point is whether to implement it or not. Yeah, exactly. So last question coming from Professor Cheung. Please, briefly, and then we also go to the next round of questions proposed by our stimulators. So Professor Cheung.
Yes, we focus a lot on the government. I would like to ask my colleagues in what ways, like we, educational institutions, like represented by Professor Joseph Nye, and the leading journalist, Mr. FRIEDMAN, and also, like a civil society and this, this non-for-profit organizations to promote this idea of being inclusive, positive, and collaborative mindset. Not just focus on government. We need to act, not wait for the government to take actions. Yes, that's my question. Thank you to all three of my colleagues here.
Rather, a question is more like a statement, but anyway, we can ask every one of them to respond to that. Maybe one sentence or two from every one of you, since three of you are being asked.
Well, I say, Professor Cheung, I have to speak here as a journalist, and the three most important American news organizations, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, have all been thrown out of China. Several hundred Chinese journalists have been thrown out of the United States. That it's just terrible. We are at the lowest point of understanding each other's countries since Nixon went to China.
I don't want to comment here, even though I work as a journalist, but today I'm a moderator, so I'll go to the next speaker to speak. Professor Nai.
I very much sympathize with Professor Cheung's view. My morning started with a Zoom conference, a breakfast conference, with a group called the Boston Tech Hub, which had the leaders of the major universities and technology companies in the Boston area. And the great worry we had was that the suspicion between the US and China about theft of intellectual property and technology transfer was leading to cutting back some of the very rich interchange at the scientific and university level. And there was a general agreement among the group that assembled at this breakfast that this would be bad for China and bad for the US, what was happening.
Perceptions really matter, it seems, in a lot of issues. Mr. Wang.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Bin. What I think is that it's very important at this, very special time that we should really increase the multi-level, multi-facet, and multi-angle discussion and exchanges. For example, CCG has conducted over a dozen webinars with the think tanks, chambers, social groups. I think it's important that we work together, and also CCG is working with Chinese People Association on a new study about how US and China from people to people and social society and how they fighting together. So I agree with what Professor Nai just said, to increase more players into this China-US and also other relations is more important, not only in the government, but also we should mobilize all our social sectors to really have an engaged dialogue. And then I think the discussion today we have, it's been very helpful, and we should have more of that to minimize the mistrust and disinformation.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time for our discussion among ourselves. Let's move on to the next stage. Before we move on to the next stage, I would like to say just a few words. First of all, we've been talking a lot about globalization and how geopolitics play its role, but should they be all? Obviously, we have been talking about various different issues that could have an impact also on globalization. And meanwhile, global cooperation and the platforms for cooperation exists, and how will they play their role with the support of major economies and others in the world will be a question mark. And meanwhile, we have seen a cooperation among civil societies, people-to-people exchanges. Even though Tom could argue about the disruptions, I would also brief you a little bit about even my home organization doing things about the frontline, which is bringing healthcare workers from all over the world to discuss some of the biggest issues facing them on a daily basis. So anyway, we have challenges. We also have temporary solutions. Let's go to the questions from our stimulators. And shall we have Mr. Lamsaw? I'm briefed by the producer. Mr. Lamsaw is with us, and he is ready to ask a question.
Good morning. I'm from the Embassy of Nepal. Greetings to everybody, and thank you very much for the very enlightening discussions we had this morning. My question is about the examples of inequality that we're seeing in the global fight against coronavirus. It also lays bare the structural gaps and the holes that we have in international governance, as well as the respective abilities of countries to cope with the changes brought about by, and the challenges brought about the coronavirus epidemic. For a country like Nepal, challenges such as climate change and the role of migrant workers in the economy are very important, which have had a very important impact on our development aspirations. We see that the discussions this morning were centered around several issues, some of which were like strengthening the role of international organizations. For example, WHO being successful in eradicating smallpox is a very good example of the support that the international organizations can have in the development trajectory of a developing country. And also we heard from Professor Nai about the fund, coronavirus adaptation fund. Mechanisms and funds at the initiative of international organizations can be very helpful for developing countries. So my question would be to panelists today, what do you think should be the responses and initiatives and the leadership roles of especially international organizations, but also developed countries?
Professor Knight.
Trying to assist developing countries to continue their fight against not just coronavirus, but also against inequality and underdevelopment.
Professor Knight, you want to take that because you mentioned several things and our stimulators also talk about that. Please go ahead.
Well, I'll be quick since I've already spoken on it. I'm afraid that the US and China missed what I call a Marshall Plan moment. But it's not too late. There may be a change in the American administration. It may be both leaderships will learn that they've missed such an opportunity. There's also the role of what Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has suggested, a multilateral 7 of smaller states that could take the lead. But we definitely should be thinking much more about how do we help the poor countries and make sure they don't become a reservoir for this, not just for this coronavirus in the future, continuing poverty.
Mr. Wang, you also want to take that because you've been doing research about globalization. And obviously, actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. I think now it's really a great time. I think right now it's a little bit uncoordinated, like China is doing sending experts and also assistance to many developing countries, probably including Nepal. But what I really like to see is really a globalized, coordinated approach. I think what Professor Nai suggested is an excellent idea. Why not China and the US find something really benefit to the mankind to work together to set aside differences? That's really, we need to be really, have this high moral, spirit to work together. And so those are exactly the right timing to do that. I agree with that.
And the point is not just about China and the United States, really. As our stimulator asked the question, there are huge numbers of developing countries and underdeveloped economies, poverty issues, underdevelopment after the pandemic, or also going parallel with the issue of the pandemic. Professor Xiang.
Well, I mean, this is the reason why international organization is so important. If it's led by WHO with the strong support from China and US, the whole issue could be much easier. A lot of accusations will go away. So this is the time for strengthening international organizations. China, US should, as Professor Joseph Nye suggested, maybe we should be a leader in contributing in resources, making sure they'll be spreading globally, especially to less developed economies. Thank you.
50 million, I understand, the US dollars are contributed by China recently to WHO, but this is not a competition of numbers, but rather of commitment. Mr. Friedman, go ahead.
Well, before, let me put it this way, Joe Nye and I were raised in an era when the greatest threat to the United States was the expansion of the Soviet Union from east to west. I believe that before the coronavirus, the greatest threat to global stability was the breakdowns of states from the south and the movement of people from zones of disorder into what they thought would be a world of order. These mass immigration flows from Central America in our hemisphere, from Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Middle East, even Central Asia into Europe, and fundamentally changing the politics of both Western Europe and the United States, creating these populist nationalist backlashes. So again, I go back to that what was happening before the coronavirus came. And the coronavirus is going to so fundamentally hammer so many of these countries that were already fracturing and spilling people out that I believed before that we needed just what Joe said, a Marshall Plan to stabilize the zones of disorder. Otherwise, they will become now not only sources of disorder that we feared in the previous sort of classical sense of terrorism or criminality or just unrivaled uncontrolled immigration, but now a disease in a really way that will be frightening.
Okay, and we have another stimulator who is going to ask the question, Mr. Yoganathan. Do we have Mr. Yoganathan with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Sir, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Considering the time, I will keep my question very short. Four of you spoke about the impact and the global kind of leadership. My question for four of you, or one of you can answer. How do you see the global leadership for the COVID-19? If we could see the global leadership response for the health impact, we could see the WHO leading. Or if you see the global economic impact response, so IMF or World Bank, or collectively, who will lead it? UN or some countries, or all the countries come together and plan something to mitigate the global impact of COVID-19. Thank you.
You seem to further proceed from the earlier discussion about exactly what should be the format, who is playing a role, what is the plan, and what do we do, shall we do from now on? That's more specific. Mr. Friedman, you want to take first, and then we go in turn.
I would simply say, look, historically, the United States played three roles in the face of global crises, whether they were ecological or financial or military. One is we were the coordinator. We were the people who galvanized the coalition. Number two, we were a source of aid and comfort to people who needed it. And number three, we were a source of facts, of science, of good ideas. And I would simply say this administration is either unable, unwilling, incapable of playing that role. And that's why we're not leading. That was how we led, as coordinator, as a source of aid and comfort, and as a source of science, facts, and authority. And this administration we have is unable or incapable of playing that role, or unwilling.
Professor Lai?
I agree with what Tom said. If you look back to the Great Recession of 2008-9, we helped to mobilize the group of 20 to get countries to make sure that they didn't turn to protectionism or beggar thy neighbor responses to the economic downturn. And the G20 did play a useful role. Today, there's nothing like that. I mean, basically, there's been no sign of that kind of leadership. And while you can have proposals like Kevin Rudd's that I mentioned of smaller countries taking a lead, it still does take the US and China, which are the two largest economies of the world, to participate. And it's not enough for them just to compete for who has done more on this gesture or that gesture. They have to cooperate to galvanize other countries into a major response. And I'm afraid we're not going to see that with this administration.
Mr. Wang, we've seen interactions among the countries as a result of the public health hazard COVID-19. Meanwhile, China has been playing its role. So maybe it's also a good time for us for you to help us to understand what exactly has been done. And not just by China alone, but also from China's perspective, together with the others. Is there some lights at the end of the tunnel now we can see for globalization, for real specific plans?
I think this broad dialogue we're having today is really useful, but particularly from such a distinguished panelist. What I think is that for this coronavirus. I mean, the G20, we only had one meeting. I'm very pleased at that time that President Xi and President Trump had the telephone call the next day. That's really a great moment, probably just very temporarily. But we hope that that dialogue continues. You know, and President Xi is calling a number of countries. I think President Xi and probably President Trump should have more frequent calls to work together. And also, we would like to see the UN act together. I mean, UN Security Council haven't conducted one meeting yet. But we see G7 has had a monthly virtual meeting, not G20, whereas Joseph said, you know, the G20 is the key part. But also we should revive, you know, like WHO and WTO, because for the down the road, we need economy recovery. We need a global governance of health system enhancement. So it's important that we should have heads of state, diplomacy, you know, play a role again, and particularly President Trump and President Xi should talk more. But also, we are not having, you know, Biden is you know, in the election now, and he's trying to revive the U.S. leadership in the global system. I think, you know, we could find many things to work together with China, and so hopefully we either President Trump or President candidate Biden, that we should really find a way to work together, and this is the golden opportunity to work together and to, you know, lead the world out of this crisis. And also we should work with EU and Japan and then ASEAN, yes, you know, Russia and all the countries then together, and that also very, very important.
I just want to say one thing before I go to Professor Cheung for your answer on this important question. Not many real discussions have been taking place, shall we say, over the past 100 days since the outbreak about real global cooperation and how this should happen. Not just about vaccines, not just about you know, treatment and the discovery of the disease, but rather more than that. I'm so glad that in this conversation we're having today, we're having some real thinkers and also doers at the same time on this topic. So Professor Cheung, I want to go to you about that. After all of these beautiful words, I'm sure you have some specific plan already. Go ahead.
We will try our best to turn this crisis into opportunity. This is a part of the Chinese traditional saying. And you know, I list out the three things I believe is so essential for this effecting of the system we have. Number one, U.S. must resume its leadership role, indispensable nation. Number two, China, U.S. must work together. And number three, this international organization must be strengthened. Three things. The first two are preconditions. If you don't have the first two, it's difficult to talk about effective international organization. We have so many global issues to worry about. It's the plan A, no plan B. It's my view, okay.
Four sentences can sum up pretty much your ideas, very targeted, obviously. And Professor Nai, I want you to comment on, if possible, Professor Cheung's words, no plan B.
Well, I agree 100% with what Professor Cheung said. We have to develop institutions, but institutions depend upon the largest countries working to give them strength, and that requires them to cooperate. So I think he's correct. Frankly, I'm afraid what we're going to see is a failure of cooperation, and that we're likely to see increased populism in the democratic countries and a worsening of US-China relations and the use of technology for authoritarian purposes. I think that's the more likely outcome, but everything I'm trying to do in writing and speaking is to make sure we don't have that plan B, and that we go to Professor Cheung's plan A.
Jen,
go ahead, Tom.
I just want to check it. It's 11:30 here, and I've been up since very early in the morning. Yeah. So I just want to check when we're going to wrap this up. I really enjoyed this, but I can't stay up much later.
We are wrapping it up. Final words, if I can, sir, from all of you. If there is a plan that you can provide, Professor, I know you already provided a plan for several times, but anyway, if there's a plan and a plan of actions that you can propose, what would that be in terms of our topic? COVID-19 vis-a-vis globalization? Tom, since we are very much, the clock is ticking, go ahead, you go first.
I think Joe said it, Chen, and Professor Cheung as well, you know, and Henry, we've all said it in different ways. If the United States doesn't lead, and if the US and China don't work together, nothing really happens. We need to do big, hard things today. And big, hard things can only be done together. And big, hard things can only be done if the two biggest, toughest, wealthiest, and most powerful players work together. We did it in the movie The Martian. We need to do it now, not in Hollywood, but in real life.
On Earth, indeed. Big, hard things let the two big powers, China and the United States, work together for real. And Mr. Wang?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we, you know, given the difficult situation, we really should work together. You know, let have UN conduct a special, you know, the coronavirus summit of some kind, and then maybe also G20 should really work again, have another round of talking. We should have all the health ministers of the world working together, have a special meeting on that. We should have this, all the trade ministers of all countries and work together. So I think, you know, we should strengthen the multilateral dialogue and find a plan to work on that, have a guideline for developing countries to act on that. So right. And also we should eliminate all the tariff on the medical aid and our medical suppliers and fighting the coronavirus. And in the end, we should really have a more, just like World I or World II, the trade to stimulate the recovery, and the same for the 208. We should really keep the free trade and the liberalization of free trade.
There is real plan, Mr. Wang argues. Let's just have the health ministers, the trade minister to talk one another to begin with. Those are actionable plans, I would say. Thank you very much. Professor Xiang, you want to repeat the same plan or you have other words?
I think it's important to have the talents in place, not only the plan. You need more young talents. They're truly globally minded, shoulder global responsibility. They really can compete and collaborate with compassion and empathy. That's the key. We need more of those people, whether political leaders, leader for civil society, or business leaders. That's what
okay, got it. The leaders. Professor Nai, final words from you. Real plan, actionable plan, please.
The Americans should elect a new president. That new president should call Xi Jinping and the European leaders and the Japanese leader, and should arrange for an emergency meeting of the G20, as well as an emergency meeting of the Security Council, and focus it on strengthening the WHO and on developing a major fund to help poor countries.
Well, we don't want to interfere into anybody's internal elections, but
that was purely my own.
Yeah, right. It is a very important step-by-step plan, Professor Nai, you just proposed. We hope all parts will be making their efforts to make real things, the big-hearted things, happen. For now, thank you so much, the four of you, for staying up late in North America, and also to starting your day with this thought-provoking conversation here in Beijing. On behalf of all of us participating in this dialogue, I also want to thank our organizer, Boao Forum for Asia, and I guess also for the world, to talk about this timely and important topic. Hope to have future opportunities for real interaction. Thank you so much. Have a great sleep and also have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. See you later.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.